All right, AP, this is part two of the circular flow model. You can see that we still have the sectors, households, the product market, firms, factor market. You still have the arrows of money flowing throughout. But now what we're going to talk about is leakages and injections. So for example, you could have a leakage, okay, out of the factor market. Instead of the money just going here, which was national income, now you could have money flowing out to different sectors. So we're going to go through and talk about some of these different areas. The first one I want to talk about is this one right here. This is the financial market. And I want to apologize for drawing this so small. I should have ended up drawing it a little bit bigger, but ends up, I screwed up. What you have with the financial market is a lot of different areas. You have the banks, you have the Federal Reserve, you have stocks, bonds, all these different areas that control the money supply and, different areas you can make money and so on. The second sector we're going to add is the government. You have the government that definitely buys stuff, okay, and transfers money back and forth. So sometimes the government will give money to households, sometimes households will give it to money, sometimes the financial market will give it to the government, as they're doing right now with what's happening in our economy. And then, of course, the third sector that we're going to end up adding with leakages and injections is the foreign markets. So I'm going to go ahead and put in foreign market. All right. So at the foreign markets, sometimes money's coming this way, sometimes it's going that way, sometimes it's coming in and out here as well. So let's go through and let's talk about some of those leakages and injections. And let's start right here. So with the factor market, what happens is you have all these businesses, the factor market, that sometimes instead of just giving all the money towards labor, so before we talked about if $100 comes in, instead of $100 just going to households, sometimes some of that money, okay, might end up going into the financial market. And these businesses, they might end up saving. So we're just going to go ahead and list that as savings for those companies. Now let's go ahead, let's go up to the financial market. So with financial market to households, sometimes they give money to households based off of some of the investments that they have. So this could be an example, it could be loans. Other examples could end up being interest payments. Another example would be profits. So an example would be, let's say that I end up buying bonds, okay, from the financial market. The interest payments that I would receive, okay, would be money that they would give me sometimes yearly, sometimes when the bond is due. Otherwise, profits, if I buy stocks and then I sell them for a gain, the profits that I would receive would come back from the financial market to the household. Otherwise, just me borrowing money to buy a house, to buy a car, something like that. I fill out paperwork for a loan, they'd end up giving me money. So there's different ways, okay, that the financial markets give households money. And then, of course, the main one where we give them money is savings. And of course, it could be payments and stuff like that for loans as well. But the main one is households taking their money, putting it into the financial market is typically called savings. And later on, we'll talk about investments, but that's more of a micro term. Mainly when we talk about investments in macroeconomics, it's dealing with businesses investing by buying new capital, hiring new labor, things like that. So we don't want to really talk about that as investment. We'll just call it savings. If we go to the next sector, okay, from financial markets to the government, typically this arrow is pointing towards the government, meaning the money flow is going from the financial market to the government. And the main reason why is the government's running a deficit. So all the money that they bring in each year, they end up spending more than what they have. So they need to borrow money. So that's from the financial market. And this would be called government borrowing. Now, if the government ran a surplus, which they don't do very often, the last time was the late 1990s, if they ended up running a surplus, they would take the extra money that they had and they would put it in the financial market. And the arrow would be going the opposite way. But typically where we live, okay, is we typically have to go through and borrow money from the financial market to pay our bills, okay, for the government. Now with the government to households, what we call these are transfer payments. A transfer payment is any payment that the government gives to households. So you could have welfare, you could have food stamps, you could do a tax rebate, would end up being a transfer payment back to the households. And right now, with what's going on with the coronavirus, they're talking about possibly giving tax rebates to households, $1,000 per adult, $2,000 per adult. It all depends. They're still trying to figure that out right now. But that would be a transfer payment where the government's trying to give households money. So then the households would, of course, spend the money in the economy and try to keep the economy flowing, because it's the circular flow of money trying to keep the economy strong. Now, households, when we give them money, okay, typically that's through taxes. So we're just going to call that taxes. And of course, this would be federal taxes, households giving the federal government money. The one arrow I forgot to put in here, which is a very important one, is this arrow right here. So from the government going to the product market, this is government spending. Right now, our government's going to end up spending a lot of money on a lot of different things. The temporary hospitals. Otherwise, the government ends up buying things for the military. The government buys desks for schools, all those different types of things. So any type of government spending would be going into the product market. All right, now, okay, the other one is households. If you take a look, households, it goes to the product market. Right before it gets to the product market, the money flows off. Really, the money goes into the product market, and the product market is actually the one giving it to the foreign market. But we're going to go ahead and draw it right here that it branches off, because it's really the households that are buying the goods from other countries, so from the foreign market. So if we want to buy chocolates from Switzerland, if we want to buy cars from Japan, or any electronics or something like that, or a lot of the goods that we end up buying from China, we end up sending money to them. So remember, this is the money flow. So when I call this imports, remember, imports are usually into our country, but this is the money going for the imports, okay? That's why this one is labeled imports. So the arrow ends up going towards the foreign market, because that's the money flow in order to buy our imports. Now, of course, the foreign markets, when they buy our goods, when they send the product market money because they're buying our goods, okay, this is considered exports, because it's the money for the exports. Okay, now if we went back to the previous circular flow model that I did, I had arrows coming with the money, and then I had arrows going back. So the arrow going back would be the exports, and the arrow coming this way would be the imports coming in. But it's the money for the imports and the money for the exports. Now the last arrow with the injection, and this would be a leakage, this would be an injection into our economy, and this would be an injection. Typically what happens with the United States, let's say we buy $100 worth of imports, chocolate, cars, different things like that. What happens is that $100, remember, goes into this box, and it has to come out. Typically, foreign markets don't spend all the money back on our goods because our goods are expensive. So let's say they only spend $80 buying our goods. There's still $20 left in this box. So it has to come back out somewhere. Typically where it ends up coming out is right here. Okay, so this would be called a capital inflow then. And let's say it's the remainder of the $20. So what they would do is they'd say, you know what, we don't want to buy those expensive goods. Instead, we're going to go ahead and we're going to invest and buy some bonds that are really good deals, or we're going to buy some stocks that are really good deals, or we're going to put it in banks and get a really good interest rate. So that money would flow into our economy. So that's why it's called an inflow. Now, if we bought $100 worth of their goods and they bought $180 worth of ours, then what would happen is we'd have to take the extra $80 that we have, and it would end up going towards them, and it would go into their financial markets, okay? And that would be considered a capital outflow. But typically, the United States, okay, we have a trade deficit, so typically what happens is the money flows into our economy. That's why China has a lot of our bonds that they've purchased. That's why Japan and some of those places have bought a lot of stocks in different companies here in the United States, because they have a bunch of our extra money, and the money has to flow back in theory. All right, if you have any questions, make sure you email me.